Very experience of reporting on the overdose crisis for me has been really painful, but also really important. I remember a conversation I had with Jason Merker. He's like, look, like opioids are a problem here for sure, but really crystal meth is like the big thing. And then that all changed. And I watched what happened to my home city of Vancouver happen again here in Saskatoon.
Hey everyone, my name is Donna and I'll be your host tonight. And let's bring in Zach. Hey Zach, how's it going?
It's going okay, Donna. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. A little bit hot. Hot weather and hot lights, but other than that, I'm great.
You're hanging in there. That's what matters.
and Dad's trying to drown us out with the music at the moment. It's a party all of a sudden. Where's the neon lights and the whistles and stuff? Anyways, is there anything that you'd like to say before we get started tonight?
Mostly just that I'm happy to be here. My name is Vescera, and I'm the health reporter at the Saskatoon Star Phoenix, and I've been covering Saskatchewan's overdose crisis for about 3 years now, and continue to do so. I think it's one of the more under-examined health crises in Canada, so I'm psyched to be here and to be talking about it.
Awesome, thank you, and thank you so much for being here tonight, Zach. All right, here we go. Okay, so as you mentioned, you've been covering the overdose crisis for several years now. And, you know, from conversations with other people in the community, you're like the go-to person when it comes to covering topics like substance use and misuse. So I think maybe one of the best places to begin would be like, why are you passionate about these topics?
Oh man, that's a great question. I love that I'm the go-to person for anything, just to start off.
You are spoken very highly of.
I would, you know, some gifted liars in that case. I guess to answer the question, like why am I passionate about this? It comes from a lot from my personal background. I was born and raised in Vancouver, which for me meant kind of getting a firsthand look at the overdose crisis in my home city. My mom works with the city of Vancouver and is active on the decriminalization file, among other things. So topics like substance use were never something that we were kind of kept from. It was literally dinner table conversation, and we were really encouraged to think a lot about it, and to remember that people who use drugs are people, and that was something that was really fundamental to me growing up. So when I became a reporter, when I was attending the University of British Columbia and writing for their student newspaper, literally substance use policy was the very first thing I wrote about. It was my very first article was about substance use at UBC. That continued when I interned at the Vancouver Sun, and when I came to Saskatoon as a reporter in 2019, that was the first conversation I had here with a source was Jason Merker and talking about substance use. So here I am today.
Cool, and we're very fortunate to have you. So in our previous conversation, you had talked about a 7-part series that you wrote called Trapped. It sounded absolutely amazing to me, and unfortunately, I'm not a paper reader. I like to listen to stuff. It's largely time constraints more so than a desire to do so. Someday I hope to have the time and the attention span, but with 2 little ones, it's...
That's fair.
So I'd like, if you could, to tell our viewers a little bit about that series, because like I said, it sounded absolutely remarkable. And in that, can you tell us where we can find that?
Totally, absolutely. I mean, one thing that I really noticed as a reporter covering substance use and misuse in Canada, so much reporting that exists on it today feels like this grim body count. It really hyper fixates on like things like coroner's reports and reports from experts and things like that. And oftentimes the major failing is it doesn't feature people who use drugs enough. It doesn't actually highlight the people who are being impacted. And that always struck me as being really contradictory. Like if you were writing about cancer treatment, you would want to have a patient with cancer, right? And if we consider substance use to be a health problem with various socioeconomic and societal factors contributing to it, Why aren't we talking to people who use drugs?
Mm-hmm.
And beyond that, I kind of thought to myself, well, are drugs the only part of the story? So often when I talk to people who use drugs, they're talking to me about housing. They're talking to me about social income policy. They're talking to me about like intergenerational trauma. In Saskatchewan, they're talking a lot about HIV, substance use being the primary way by which HIV is spread in this province.
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided I wanted to do a series that broke down those issues one by one, looked at it through the lens of people who use drugs, and explored kind of the systemic failures that have led to the overdose crisis in Saskatchewan as we know it today. I don't have to tell you, if we are going by that grim body count, it's more than doubled since I got to this province on a perennial basis. We expect that more than 400 people died of fatal overdose in 2021 alone. You can find that series trapped on the Star Phoenix's website. You don't have to track down the original newspaper. And I hope you enjoy reading it because I really enjoyed writing it.
Mm-hmm. It sounds fascinating. I wish more people would take the approach that you do in an effort to kind of humanize it, because when you see a lot of numbers and statistics and stuff, like on the one hand, yeah, you're cognizant of the fact that these are people, but at the same time, they have just become numbers and statistics and data, and the humanity of it all kind of gets lost in the shuffle.
Totally.
So I think like I know when we talked. It might be my misconception, for lack of a better word, of media as a whole. I was really quite surprised at your assertion that the Star Phoenix doesn't edit your work. Like it's very factual. Nobody else is slanting it in one particular direction or another. There's no agenda. There's nothing. Like that was quite an eye opener for me, and newfound respect for the Star Phoenix. So maybe this is a good spot to talk about media perception.
Commonly known fact, not a point of contention. Post Media, the newspaper company I work for, its editorials and opinion pages do have a right-wing slant. I don't think any reasonable person will dispute that. Mm-hmm. The Star Phoenix does definitely, it edits my work insofar as they check for things like typos and make sure that things are factually accurate. Mm-hmm. But over me and said, hey, that story you're writing is too lefty or too right. It's too friendly to people who use drugs. We're spiking it or we're taking it out. That's never happened to me at the Star Phoenix, and it didn't happen to me at the Vancouver Sun or the province either. Mm-hmm. But I definitely see where people kind of come from and why that misconception has kind of flourished, because I think a lot of publications really struggle to differentiate, their opinion writing and what reporters are doing, what we're doing and trying to report the facts. Mm-hmm. And that's super harmful for me as a reporter, right? That's a real challenge for, I think, everyone in the business, because mm-hmm. when they see like opinion articles or op-eds written by, a columnist or an opinion writer who, is maybe pushing an angle that is like, for example, anti-harm reduction. Sometimes people will take that and they'll put that onto me, or they'll put that onto another reporter, mm-hmm. and they'll dig to us, or they'll have misgivings about doing so because of that perceived slant. And I think that's just a challenge that we as media have to like do a better job of like educating the public about. Mm-hmm. I for sure wouldn't let anything influence what I consider to be a good story, and how I approach things. So we need to make sure it's clear to people. I think that frankly we're the ones dropping the ball on that.
Well, to that point, and I'm going to use a personal reference here, like my parents. They watch CNN and a couple of the other big news stations, and mm-hmm. I think like 99% of the people presenting the information are opinion led, but it's being presented as a factual or sort of like yourself, like a reporter. So I think it's becoming increasingly difficult for people to differentiate between mm-hmm. what is reporting and what is an op-ed. But
yes,
anyways,
totally.
So how do you think like the media could maybe change that perception? Because I agree with you completely. It's not doing you guys any favor when you're trying to present facts.
Yeah, no, it's a huge problem. And part of it is like kind of difficult to tackle holistically, because mm-hmm. like you said, when big cable TV channels are doing this in the United States, that has a trickle down effect on all media, I'd argue. It erodes trust in everybody. But I can't phone the president of CNN and be like, hey man, knock it off. I can't phone the president, I would love to. I can't phone the president of Fox News and say, hey, that be, hey man, this whole thing you're doing, I don't like it. I don't think it's good.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, like it's a huge issue. And I think part of it is like a public education thing. We need to get way better at labeling what is an opinion article and what is like purely news, and make sure that distinction is ultra clear to our readers, and like
Mm-hmm.
even just put out more information explainers. Like, here's the difference between these two things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think generally a lot of newspapers and other publications could do a better job of making sure that even the opinion content is fact checked. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you shouldn't be able to present information that's like incomplete or incorrect. I really do strongly believe that. I don't think that's
Mm-hmm.
responsible.
Mm-hmm.
And then from our perspective as and from our viewpoint as reporters, I think we just got to be really, really, really clear about what our position is. Like, one of the challenges, and we talked about this earlier, one of the challenges I have as a reporter sometimes reporting on substance use and abuse is that oftentimes people kind of will characterize me as an advocate for harm reduction.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I don't think that's accurate isn't because I'm opposed to harm reduction. I think most people who read my work will take the opposite impression of me. It's because I think that there's this line between what is a reporter and what is an advocate, and I think it's an important one, because I think I would be a really crummy advocate. And I think I do, I really do. And I think that, like, what I do as a reporter is kind of in a different league, because I'm just sort of, or in a different kind of ballpark, I'll say rather,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm just trying to report the information and make sure that people have the best information available to them. And if I can do that in a way that highlights the lived experiences of people who use drugs and what, fantastic, I'm going to absolutely do that. And if that has benefits for how we talk about that and how things move forward, fantastic. But I want to make sure I keep that distinction with my sources and how I'm doing things, so that I'm not seen as being like inherently biased. And that's something that I try to do. Is it easy, like straightforward? Not at all. It's a line and a conversation I have to have all the time. But better to do the work than not do the work, I think.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, like, what makes you think you'd make a terrible advocate?
Oh my God, I never shut up. I think I think I would be an awful. No, seriously, I think I would be an awful advocate, because I would like chase too many rabbits at once. You know what
Oh,
I mean?
okay. Yeah.
Like, I would chase too many rabbits at once. I would go after too many goals. I wouldn't be organized. And I think I have like a certain cynicism that is like really beneficial for me as a reporter
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, but probably would not be good if I had to like champion things and talk to other advocates. I wouldn't be good at that. I think people like I understand Mom Stop the Harm are sponsoring this video, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
people like folks in Mom Stop the Harm, like shout out to Maria Giordi. They're
Mm-hmm.
fantastic advocates. They're always like, they're available. They're really resilient. They're there to educate. They have patience and calm that I deeply admire,
Mm-hmm.
but that I do not possess. And that's the line I would say I draw between us.
Very, and I might add as well, and I don't know you like on a personal level, but their level of diplomacy is something that I
Yeah.
lack. I'm very emotionally driven, so and some of the points that you made
fair.
about like chasing too many rabbits, that would be me. Like, I'm literally like squirrel.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I'm in
exactly, right? I'm scatterbrained too. I'm in the same plane as you. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, that's awesome that you found your niche. So if we, maybe since Mom Stop the Harm was just addressed, I think maybe right now would be a really good time to take a break to hear from our premier sponsor. We've watched our children walk away. We've felt hopeless, powerless. We are Moms Stop the Harm. We are not hopeless. We are not powerless. Stronger Together Canada is a national network of peer-led support groups to help navigate these challenges. If you're coping with a child's substance use, reach out to www.holdinghopecanada.org. If you've lost a child to drug poisoning or overdose, www.healingheartscanada.org. We're here to help, and we are stronger together. Okay, so I'd also just like to mention that tonight's show is also brought to you in part by Prairie Sky Recovery Center. Okay, so moving on. I would like to talk a little bit about the Saskatchewan government's response to the pandemic. Like there was a multitude of layers that you addressed during our initial conversation. But I think one of the ones that was of particular interest to me was the fact that there was the hotels were used for basically safe consumption sites, but in that same funding cycle, PHR was denied funding for the work that they do. Can you unpack that
Totally,
a little
yeah.
bit for
I
us?
think. Oh, I would love to. I think that the way I would put it is that the overdose crisis and harm reduction in Saskatchewan and government's response to it is very often contradictory. It
Mhm.
is going in two directions at the same time. Government is saying, and in some cases enacting plans to integrate harm reduction into more of what they do. Naloxone is way more available than it used to be, for
Mhm.
example. On the other hand, they've yet to embrace things like supervised consumption sites, such as the one that Prairie Harm Reduction has been trying to open in Saskatoon. And for those who don't know, Prairie Harm Reduction is a nonprofit here, and they've applied 3 times for funding for a supervised consumption site they run, which is the only one in Saskatchewan. And 3 times the provincial government has said, no, we're not going to fund this. And shortly after the second time they were rejected, we were able to report and confirm that Saskatchewan's government had created a bunch of overdose prevention sites in various hotels across Saskatchewan. And these were hotels where people with COVID-19 were, who didn't have another place to stay, were staying while they recovered from COVID. This was before vaccines were widely available.
Mhm.
And the government had figured out that if people are who are used are if these are people who are using drugs and they have COVID, they're not going to stay in a hotel magically and get over substance dependence just because you tell them to. They're going to be using. And they're like, okay, we need to make sure they can use safely. So we're going to make overdose prevention sites and make this safer. And one of the people that they contracted to do this was Prairie Harm Reduction. So you had this weird kind of paradox where Prairie Harm Reduction was being paid by government to provide a supervised drug consumption service in Saskatoon in a hotel for a certain group of people, but they were being denied funding to provide that service to the community at large,
Mhm.
anyone who uses drugs in the city of Saskatoon.
Mhm.
And to me, that kind of illustrates the fundamental weirdness of Saskatchewan, where
I like
there is
that.
an
The fundamental
there
weirdness of Saskatchewan.
the fundamental weirdness, because I've obtained like internal government briefing notes that repeatedly say very clearly that, yeah, based on all the available evidence, we know that supervised consumption sites uh, save lives. We know that they are cost effective, and we know generally that they work and that there is a demand for them in Saskatoon. Like that's super clear in all of government's internal memos.
Hmm.
And they funded them in the past, right, for the specified purpose they had. So there's kind of an acknowledgement there, but they won't fund it for the general public. And I think that's something that, like, I've interrogated it, I've gone at it, but
Mhm.
they have yet to really come up with a convincing answer as to why, why that kind of tension there. And
So,
I think you
if I
find
can
that.
interrupt for one quick
Go ahead.
second. So what
Totally,
is the best
totally.
reasoning that they've given you to this
The
point?
the best reasoning they've given us is, hey, that was a specific tool for a specific job. Yeah, we know these things work in other provinces. We think Saskatchewan needs a Saskatchewan solution. And
Hmm.
generally, what they've kind of alluded to when they say that, what they actually mean is PHR is asking for too much money. That's usually the issue they bring up. For
Hmm.
those who don't know, Prairie Harm Reduction has asked for between, I think, they've asked for up to 1.3 million. That's like been their big ask on an annualized basis.
Hmm.
And the government has often basically said that's too much money. We prefer to spend this on various things that we can put like across the province in a broader geography, right?
Hmm.
That being said, the obvious response to that to me, and this is something that again I think needs to be pointed out, like 1.3 million is not a crazy sum of money when you
No.
look at a health budget that is in excess of 4 billion.
Hmm.
It's not a crazy amount of money, right?
Hmm.
So a lot going on here, but that is a government's official line on it. That is what they say about it.
Hmm. Hmm. It's interesting. And so
Mhm.
I'm wondering if you can speak to, like, in terms of this budget that PHR is asking for, and given the fact that you have privy to some of these documents that the general public just doesn't have, what are you seeing in terms of like actual number breakdown in terms of if they were to give that budget to PHR compared to what we're spending, in policing and hospitalizations and all these sorts of issues that are interconnected?
It's a great question. And yeah, that's one of the fundamental arguments. That's one of the primary arguments in favor of supervised consumption sites is that they have a positive sort of trickle down effect because that's less paramedics coming to the scene or fewer rather paramedics coming to the scene. That's, all these social benefits that kind of come from it. And I haven't really seen a detailed study of that in Saskatchewan
Mm-hmm.
in terms of like what it would mean for first responder costs. What I have seen is a study that was done, I think back in 2015, and it was in regards to purely HIV. And for those who don't know, Saskatchewan has the highest HIV transmission rate in Canada. And we are also one of the worst provinces when it comes to getting people with HIV on their medications. And substance use or sharing of needles is the primary way HIV is spread. We're the only province in Canada where that is the case. And the estimated cost of someone getting HIV happens to be 1.3 million. That is how much it costs over that person's lifetime to provide medication and lost labor and all those things. And what the study basically found in 2015 was, okay, yeah, if we have a safe consumption site, it would realistically say it would prevent probably at least a few HIV infections a year. But you only have to prevent one to get that lifetime saving of 1.3 million. And that's something that still blows my mind, but that's one of the most effective, I think, cost estimate arguments in favor of a supervised consumption site in Saskatoon. And that's something that you often hear people point to is even if we're just talking about HIV, we will realize those cost savings with one prevented case.
Right. Huh. That's fascinating. I know we've had a couple of previous guests speak to this issue, and one in particular, a pharmacist who again has privy to information that nobody else has, and very thankful for her information. But I'm kind of wondering, having had the personal experience that I have, I'm aware that there is a needle exchange program. So like any insights as to why our AIDS numbers are so high when supposedly there is this needle exchange program?
Totally, yeah, and it's a great question too, right? Because it's like there was one study done. It came out of Montreal, and it estimated that Saskatchewan actually is giving away more needles per capita than any other Canadian province, which is like kind of crazy. And like there is a very busy needle exchange run by the Saskatoon Tribal Council that is right next to PHR as it happens. I visited that site, and I've seen them like give out like hundreds of needles at a time sometimes. And the reality is, I think this is one thing that isn't really well understood about HIV in Saskatchewan and also our overdose crisis. But we have like a not insignificant, community of people or population who are so marginalized and distrusting of the medical system for myriad reasons, for a variety of reasons, that aren't reaching them, and that's not enough for them. And I think it's kind of worth pointing out, right? Just because you're handing out a bunch of clean needles, I mean that the problem is solved immediately. Exchanges also usually operate on banking hours, right? They're usually closed by like 5 o'clock, except for grams in places like North Battleford. There are exceptions, obviously. But if you're someone who's using drugs and you want to use it like, let's say 3 a.m., you're not going to wait until you're not going to just sit there and wait and hang out. Probably going to be in a position where you have to use what you have. So for all those reasons, we continue to see terrible sort of AIDS transmission rates in Saskatchewan.
Interesting. And I don't know if you were able to see the comment pop up there, Zach, but our friend Barb Fornsler comments that we need a needle distribution, not just exchange.
Yeah, that's an important nuance right there. I think one thing that I know about like the needle exchanges, that's kind of my contra idea of bringing one needle back that's dirty to get one that's clean, which some places do that, can create like basically a messed up economy of people like trying to get dirty needles so they can get clean ones, and then it becomes like unhealthy and unhelpful. There's all kinds of problems with our current system.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. I remember situations where, people I knew were carrying like 20 dirties around with them because there was this, I don't know, this misconception that you had to have a certain amount even in order to do the exchange or
Mm,
something. I don't know. There's usual sort of confusion and misinformation.
yeah.
I don't
It's
know.
a weird like microeconomy that you're creating, and it's not a healthy one, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So let's get back into media reporting, all that kind of fun stuff,
Hmm. Totally.
So what was I going to say there? We talked about uh, the way things had changed February 20th to October 2021. And I'm sorry, it was a very random note that I made, but I have it like double starred
Hmm.
and boxed in. So I assume it was a very important
Totally.
point to make. So, and you seem to know what I'm talking
Right.
about.
No,
Thank God.
I know exactly
Praise
what
Jesus.
you're talking about. Yeah. No worry, I got you. I got you.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank
Well,
you.
what like that
I
kind of
was
comes
literally
to like
starting to
when
sweat
I
here, like, holy shit.
no, it's all good. I know exactly what you're talking about. That's the time frame in which Saskatchewan's drug supply, in my mind, just had this like fundamental seismic shift.
Mm,
Um, for context here, when I got here in September 2019, I talked to you about my first conversation I had, which was with Jason Mercredi. We went
mhm,
for a coffee at the Night Oven, and he was telling me that yeah, opioids huge problem here, always has been, but crystal meth is the bigger one right now, right?
mhm,
For a number of reasons. That's still the case for sure. Crystal meth is still a huge problem, but but at that point, the opioid problem or challenge in Saskatchewan was primarily, not all, but primarily pharmaceuticals that were being diverted into kind of, I guess, the illicit drug market, if you want to call it that, right? We're talking
mhm,
about like hydromorphone and things like that.
mhm,
That was kind of the big thing that people were worried about. Fentanyl was definitely there. It was getting worse, appearing more often, but it wasn't on like the scale it was at in Alberta, BC, and even Ontario.
mhm,
But everyone kind of knew, the chief coroner, everyone else, that it was coming.
mhm,
And suddenly, right around the time the pandemic started, people began to notice this just fundamental shift in the drug supply in Saskatchewan. Like it wasn't like overnight, but very quickly in that kind of February to October 2020 timeframe, the drug supply went from always being uncertain to being just incredibly toxic, with like huge numbers of things being mixed everywhere.
mhm,
We saw benzodiazepines mixed with opioids in Saskatchewan, which previously was something that was like fairly, heard of in Vancouver and other places, not so much heard of here. And correspondingly, people started to die. Just a huge number of people started to die.
mhm,
The fact that it coincided with the pandemic too means that some people were cut off from social support networks, out of work. Um, there was this mass destabilization that a lot of people, it affected them very deeply and personally in a very hard way.
mhm,
I talked to people who, their family members died and they said, they couldn't go to their normal places. So this all happened in a flash. And suddenly it was like Saskatoon was suddenly and Regina especially, we're more comparable to Vancouver in many
mhm,
ways, in the city I grew up in. And I had to kind of watch that whole thing happen again.
mhm,
And I remember like the craziest part of that reporting for me, um, talking to the families was hard enough. But one of the things that was strange for me, it was my conversation I had then with Clive Wayhill, who's the chief coroner of Saskatchewan and previously was the chief of Saskatoon Police.
mhm,
And I kind of expected him, I guess, to say, oh, we could have never predicted this. It's unprecedented. Totally the opposite. He basically said, yeah, we knew this was going to happen. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, no, like we knew that those trends from the coast were going to move here and eventually we would come after Alberta. It was going to happen here. And that raised the question for me of like, okay, well, why weren't we ready? Like, why
yeah,
was the infrastructure not there?
mhm,
And part of that, I think, was the pandemic and how suddenly it happened. But the reality is we were caught flat-footed in so
mhm,
many ways, and we're still kind of scrambling to catch up, right? Like
mhm,
there have been some really good initiatives, I think, in terms of like naloxone being more available, drug testing strips, like a lot of stuff is happening, but it was just it was so late, and I think that a lot of the death that we're seeing today is kind of a result of that, right? We didn't
mhm,
plan.
mhm. So to put into context, because I mean I'm terrible at math on a good day. So how much lead time did Saskatchewan have? Like, can we really blame the pandemic, or can is it
I
just the fact that we our leadership kind of pooped the bed?
I mean, yeah, like in terms of like how much warning did the government need? that might come down to being a personal opinion, but I would argue that, like, you saw the emergence of fentanyl on a mass scale in Vancouver.
Hmm.
I would say like 2013, 2014 is when it got like, was
Hmm.
very clearly something was changing and it was getting extremely bad. Like I would say it
Hmm.
was years back.
Hmm.
And that was very evident to sort of everyone who lived in Vancouver and was
Well,
seeing.
and I'm sorry to cut you off,
And
but correct,
Alberta came.
correct me if I'm wrong,
Mhm.
Zach. Isn't that around the time that OxyContin itself was discontinued? Because like why
Yeah,
I'm
right,
asking that is because
give or take.
Dan
Yeah, I
and
think
I
so.
we thought we were taking Oxy 80s, and things were okay for a while. At least they seemed legitimate, and then we heard OxyContin got discontinued, and then the pills that we were
Mm,
getting suddenly, like we were snorters, so we'd crush them and they were like sand. And the
mm,
methadone clinic had just kind of was just kind of new in Saskatchewan, and we went in and we wanted to get tested. They tested for oxy, but there was nothing for fentanyl, so we were in this like weird void of what the hell are we taking. So
yeah.
if my math's correct, like Saskatchewan technically had like 6 years
Yeah, no,
roughly.
there was a fair amount of time. That's the thing. Like,
Yeah.
no matter how you're looking at it, it wasn't like this is like some kind of crazy thing that left
Like,
over like, yeah, the pandemic, yeah, the pandemic like accelerated things for sure, and it
mhm,
and it, it also like took away a lot of the resourcing, like the public health resourcing that might have
sure.
otherwise gone to that.
Hmm.
But you can, I think you can, in all fairness, say that yeah, Saskatchewan was caught flat-footed. Like
Hmm.
there's no, like I think any reasonable person looks at this and says that's not a job well done. When
Hmm.
you see this level scale of death and suffering, right? Like
Yeah.
I don't think that's a controversial thing to say in any kind of way.
Hmm.
And granted, not many other provinces have done phenomenal kind of planning or infrastructure around this too.
Hmm.
Um, but it hit Saskatchewan like a wrecking ball. Like a few years ago, if you were to compare death rates, and I know that we had a conversation just now about like not doing that too much, but if you look at that just as a pure measurement of kind of like how bad things are on a per capita level, Saskatchewan has the third highest overdose death rate in 2021 in the country out of all
Hmm.
the provinces. It's behind, I think, BC and Alberta.
Hmm.
And I think that would actually shock most people who live in Saskatchewan because there's
Hmm.
this weird idea that it hasn't happened here or didn't
Hmm.
happen here.
Yeah.
That Saskatchewan, because it's more rural, because it's not a big, urban center, whatever, that it's a city thing. It's
Hmm.
not a city thing. It happens in rural areas too. They're often ignored in this conversation. It happens in cities like Saskatoon, Regina. It's happening everywhere.
Hmm.
And it happened really fast and with really tragic results.
Hmm. Agreed. So on that point, and we touched a little bit about on this during our conversation about the methadone Methadose transition. Like, I don't know, maybe I'm
Hmm.
biased in this opinion, but it seems like we're kind of destined to the same fate in both sort of scenarios. Like we're not learning from what has happened on the coast, even though we've had more than enough warning. I don't know. Like,
Hmm.
do you have any
Yeah.
maybe more information on that?
It is kind of interesting as a reporter, right? Because one of the first things you do as a reporter is you say, okay, how have other jurisdictions coped with the same problem? What kind of archives are there? What kind of information is available there for me to understand this problem? And it's weird sometimes, like you sometimes see, I guess, a reticence for provinces to kind of follow each other, or you see certain kind of geographic differences in how they kind of tackle this problem.
Mm-hmm.
Methadone Methadose is, an example there in terms of like, how, they made that change to the kind of medication that was being dispensed. Um, and I think that, that when I think about that story, I guess what I think about most of all is it's like a classic example of why it's important to talk to people who use drugs about
Mm-hmm.
issues affecting people who use drugs, right? Like
Right.
that's something that, and that I remember like when Crackdown did their story on that issue in Vancouver, I remember
Mm-hmm.
listening to that and thinking, yeah, that's exactly why we need to be doing this kind of reporting, because if you don't, you miss stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure, like, honestly, I'm not sure if you can, I'm not sure if people who use drugs, in fact, I think you can say safely, like, people who use drugs probably have not had the kind of policy impact that they should be having in Saskatchewan and other places, right? I don't know. I don't really see a really direct way for them to influence government policy at present. You don't
Mhm.
really have that consultation kind of network that they have in BC, and it's a problem. It's just a fundamental problem.
Mhm. Yeah. And sort of, we just before the show we were talking about this issue with Keith Bowering and PHR trying to get test strips approved in the province for use at concerts.
Yeah,
And you had some interesting insights on that. And this was
totally.
complete news to me. So I would love if you would again unpack that for us.
It's another weird thing. Like, my experience reporting on the overdose crisis in Saskatchewan, right, has been, it became a problem incredibly fast. Like, it escalated as a problem really, really fast, and became, this huge issue really, really fast. And again, you see that kind of tension and sometimes paradox in government's response. So in this case, Keith Bowering, who's a harm reduction advocate who lives in Saskatoon, he partnered with Prairie Harm Reduction on a program to bring drug testing strips for benzodiazepines and fentanyl to 3 music festivals in Saskatchewan. And he was basically, they were going to use Prairie Harm insurance policy. They were going to get an exemption from the provincial government in order to, use the test strips in this space so that people wouldn't be arrested or face any kind of, legal threat for possessing illicit drugs.
Mhm.
And they were also going to do things like naloxone training. They were going to have this interactive element to it. Because no one's under any illusions that people use drugs at music festivals.
Right.
And it ended up becoming this weird bureaucratic kind of back and forth. Keith and PHR applied to the Ministry of Health here in Saskatchewan saying, hey, we want this exemption for Ness Creek. And a few weeks before, the province came back and said, no, we're not doing it. We don't really know how this is going to work. And they punted it up to the federal government.
Mhm.
And the federal government said, we've actually never approved a request like this before. We don't know what's going on either. So it was this really weird kind of conundrum because right? Because historically, provinces are the ones who approve requests like that. The
Right.
federal government, hands down the power to them to do that. But
Mhm.
now here's a case the province is kicking it right back up, saying we don't want to touch this.
Mhm.
And what ended up happening is they applied again to the federal government, and because it takes time, Keith didn't get the green light to do drug testing until Friday morning of Ness Creek Music Festival. And the festival starts on Thursday. So
Mhm.
Keith kind of lost a full day, basically, of being able to do these tests and offer it. He did eventually have some people come by, and I understand it was a successful kind of pilot. It went pretty well, but it just kind of goes to show it's another example of the weirdness of harm reduction in Saskatchewan and the political dimension there.
Mhm. Yeah, that's you think it would be like absolutely, let's do it.
Mm.
But I'm perhaps I'm often
Yeah,
in the
I mean,
weeds on that one, but
and one thing that's worth noting, right, is that the Saskatchewan government, the test strips that Keith is using, they're not special. And in fact, the Saskatchewan government has funded and expanded funding to hand out those strips all over the province for free. If you're a person who uses drugs, you can go get them and, in privacy at home.
Mhm.
The expect use them to test drugs. The
Mhm.
province literally just objected to the idea of approving a place where people could do that without legal consequence at a music festival so that
Mhm.
someone could help them with it. That's what they shut down. And
Even though
that to
there's
me is like, yeah, exactly. It's like it's a very thin kind of weird line that they're walking here, where it's
Mhm.
like that's the Rubicon they won't cross, is the idea of approving a space where people can use illegal drugs without fear of repercussion. That is kind of the line that Saskatchewan won't cross.
which is hilarious. I mean, I've been to Ness Creek, and everybody knows that well, not everybody, but a good percentage of the
Yeah,
people out there are using and security and stuff like that. They never harassed us, and we were clearly not well.
it.
So
Yeah,
it's
no,
almost like they've got this ideology that nobody uses drugs at concerts. Everybody's
yeah.
just happy.
I mean, yeah, like me and my girlfriend were actually at Ness Creek this year too, and the joke that we kind of made is that when you're out there dancing and hanging out with people, we would keep our distance for people who are visibly like drunk because they were often swinging their elbows around and like hitting people, and
Mhm.
the people who are like on LSD or whatever were like so chill and great to hang out with and very respectful of your space, and we're like, okay, we're gonna hang out with these people, you know what I mean? Like it's like, yeah, it happens at music festivals. it's a reality at music festivals. And
Yeah.
I think the festivals, their standpoint was, we know this is going to happen. We know that
Hmm.
stopping it isn't going to work. We might as well make it just a little bit safer for people.
Hmm.
And that's what they did. And now here we are.
Hmm. Well, kudos to them for actually making that happen. Like that's incredible. I have a
Mm.
comment from Steph Gray. She is saying that if it was alcohol, it would have been done instantly. And, you know, it's I don't know. I think I often liken the drug war to the prohibition of whatever year that all that
Mm.
craziness happened. Like it's just absurd. But and thank you, Barb, for commenting that Saskatchewan didn't even allow naloxone distribution until 2018, long after
Yep,
2016
true.
Health Canada moved to deregulate naloxone.
Yep, that's true
Love
as
Barb.
well.
She's always got all the stats.
We've historically, she does, yeah, and historically we've just been behind, yeah, like we've been behind most of Canada, fair to say, on all of this stuff, and
Hmm.
now here we are.
Is there anything that you'd like to say before we depart?
I guess the only thing I'll say is like the only reason that there is any reporting on substance use anywhere, and especially any good reporting on substance use anywhere, in my opinion, is because people talk to us. People with lived experience, people who have done some kind of academic study in the area, people who are in nonprofits that represent people who use drugs or work with them. Um, these are the folks that actually make it possible to do this reporting, where we are
Mhm.
only, as I don't know if I'm allowed to cuss,
Oh, it's all good.
or let's say this, or if you're thinking that like, okay, people aren't reporting about X, please get in touch with me. Like, I need your help. I would love your help. I would love to be doing a better job. So yeah, hit me up anytime.
Awesome. And so if a person was tempted to do so, how would they get a hold of you?
Oh, that's a great idea. That's a great point. Oh my God. If you go to any article I write on the Star Phoenix, my email is there on the bottom. It is ZVESCERA at postmedia.com.
Awesome.
And please feel free to reach out to me or to the Star Phoenix anytime you have an idea for a story.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Zach. It's been an awesome conversation, and I appreciate your time and everything that you do.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you guys too. You're awesome.
Awesome. Take care.